Hi, I'm Kathy from the Macedon Public Library, and today I want to talk to you about Black History Month, and that's why I called this A White Woman Tries to Understand Black History. Just to give you a teeny little bit about myself, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s in a town smack dab in the middle of Long Island. It was an integrated town, but it was very segregated. All the Black people in town lived in one area, and there were 5 elementary schools, so you did not, but only one we called it junior high, one junior high, one high school. So depending on where you lived, you might never ever go to school with a Black child until you got to middle school, junior high, 7th grade. And that's how it was for me. It was, like I said, the 60s and the 70s. So every day on TV, we would see things on the Vietnam War, and we would also see things about riots and different civil rights movement things. I was 10 when Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were killed. So I grew up with a lot of that violence on TV. There were, we called them riots in my town, but I think looking back on it, I think they were just disturbances and some, little things. But the men and the fathers in our town, in my area, would be very upset about it. My father worked at night with in a factory, and he worked with a lot of Blacks, and he liked them all because they were individuals, and he got to know them all. But then you come home, and it was different in the ones that lived in my town that were causing the trouble. He really admired a lot of the Black women that he worked with, who were holding down 2 jobs and raising a family. And he really just had wonderful things to say. So it was a bit of a dichotomy for me. I went to high school in the early 70s, and it was an interesting place. We were fearful a lot of times of things that were going to be happening. We've had to close the school, call fire alarms and things like that to go outside until the police came. You learned never to go to the bathroom because there was always problems in there. It was just not, it was just difficult at times, but I still had a wonderful time growing up, and I still have wonderful memories. I went off to college, and there were all these Black people, and they were Black people I didn't have to be afraid of. And I probably never had to be afraid, but it took a lot of self-awareness for me, having grown up in that era. And I still am always trying to be self-aware. It is something I carry with me, my childhood. And so I was very interested in Black history. And I don't want to say I'm an expert. I am certainly not. I'm just going to give you some recommendations of some books if you too want to learn to know more about what's been happening in our country that was hidden for so many years. Author and activist James Baldwin has a quote, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And so that is my life. So I'm going to start with this beautiful book. It's a Caldecott winner, which means it has the best illustrations of 2020. And it's also a Newbery Honor book, which means that they just think it's one of the best books of 2020. And it's considered a love letter to Black life in the United States, from slavery to the civil rights movement and on. And the pictures are just beautiful, and it is a poem. And it is called The Undefeated by Kwame Alexander and Kadar Nelson. And you should just page through this. It will take you 10 minutes to read, but it really is a love letter, and I think it's a beautiful book. Now I'm going to introduce some nonfiction for you. This book is called Remembering Slavery, and it's published in conjunction with the Library of Congress as a companion to the Smithsonian Productions radio documentary. Back in the 30s, when they were doing all sorts of different programs to keep people employed, like the beautiful post office murals that I don't know if anyone has ever seen or heard of, but they sent artists around to paint murals in the different post offices around the country. They went around, they sent authors and different people around to record stories from ex-slaves. This was the 1930s, so everyone that they interview is quite elderly. This is, I guess you can get the recordings somewhere, but this is the companion piece. It has beautiful pictures and tells stories, and it is not an easy book to read. I did not read all of it. I read parts of it. It really, truly shows you that not all the stories about slavery that whites want you to believe is true. That it was never a benevolent institution. And these are eyewitness accounts of things that happen. A lot of these people were children. Some of these things happened to them. And it is a really wonderful book if you really want to delve into what ex-slaves had to say. This book is called The Burning: Massacre and Destruction in the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921 by Tim Madigan. This book I loved. I did not, I would come home from work and try to read it right away. I really enjoyed it, and it is a very difficult book to read in some places. And this is one of those instances in which something happened in Tulsa and they hid it. And it happens in 1921. A young Black man is accused of attacking or assaulting, excuse me, a white woman, which, as you read all these, is a theme. And so the whites jail him, and they decide, oh, we're going to take matters into our own hands. You've heard of these things before. And so they're going to, they go to the jail and they're going to pull him out. But what was in Tulsa in 1921 was a very wealthy, well-established Black community. And they said, no, that's not what you're going to do. And so they went to the jail and they stopped it. And the next morning, thousands of whites crossed the track, the railroad tracks that divided Black Tulsa from white Tulsa, and burned it down, shot and murdered and the Blacks in their beds, and just burnt it down. And like I said, I have notes back here. The Black community was called the Negro Wall Street, and they would cross over into the white community and work, and they really got along very well until this instance. And how many did it say? They burnt down 34 square blocks of Tulsa's Greenwood. And what made this book hard to read was not that part. Afterwards, the denial. They rounded up the Blacks for having started it. They kept them in camps. They could only be released if white members of the community would come and take them. So a lot of these people were servants, or they worked in the hotels. And so those people would go and have to get them out, and they would have to vouch for them. And then they denied it all. The Blacks tried to rebuild. They had no money from anyone. They rebuilt. They were not the same. And the whites never discussed it again. And there are people who grew up in Tulsa in the 40s and 50s who had no idea that this had happened. And it wasn't the only place that this happened. And in 1980s, I'm reading some things from the back here. In the 1980s, a commission formed to investigate the state, and State Representative Don Ross is quoted, "We told these people to lift themselves up by their bootstraps, and they did, by forming the most successful Black community in America. And once they lifted themselves up by their bootstraps, we destroyed them for it." The Burning, just a fabulous, fabulous story to read, to learn about what whites did, just how much whites did to Blacks. Another wonderful book, and a very big book, but I again could not put it down, is The Warmth of Other Suns: The Epic Story of America's Great Migration by Isabel Wilkerson. I believe she has written Caste, the new book that's out. And this is, as they say, an epic story of America's Great Migration. It reads very easily, even though the print is small and there are a lot of pages. In the 6 decades between 1915 and 1917, 6 million Black Southerners left the South. They came up north, they came to Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, Chicago, Cincinnati, Cleveland, all across. And then they also went out to California. And it would transform the urban America. And it grew out of unmet promises made by the Civil War and helped push the country towards the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It was to escape Jim Crow. Jim Crow, if you don't know, is laws that the South instituted, that it was after Reconstruction, and they instituted laws just to not let the Black man improve. It lasted for 80 years, from the 1980s to the 1960s. And migration ended when the South started to change and segregation ended and everyone could vote. And so that's when the migration really ended. But by then, 47% of Black Americans lived outside of the South, as compared to just 10% before. So you can see it was just an exodus. And this book is beautifully done. She interviewed 1,200 people in New York, Chicago, LA, Milwaukee, and Oakland. And she follows 3 lives of 3 main characters and why they and how they left, and their true stories. And things that you couldn't do. It's fabulous to read this. I mean, fabulous and not in a good way. Just amazing, I guess, to read how much control whites had over Black lives in that time. You know, if you were a sharecropper, you couldn't get out of being a sharecropper. They controlled everything. At the end, you'd meet with your person that owned the land, and they would tally up what you owed. And a lot of times they said, oh, we broke even. Now we don't owe you anything. And what were you supposed to do? Where were you supposed to get money to put shoes on your kids' feet? You know, it was just, or any extra money for a doctor, for any of those things. They would, and you had to ask permission to leave. It was ridiculous. And yeah. Blacks did what the humans have done for centuries when life became untenable. And that's one of the things that it says in here. During the Irish famine, they came over here. During the Dust Bowl, they went out to California. When the Nazis took over and were persecuting the Jews, they left. And that's what the Blacks did. They left the South and they came up north. And there has been much debate about how they changed the cities. And was it good for the cities or bad for the cities when the Blacks came? But I will not share my opinion, but I'm sure you can tell what it is. And better questioned, how did they get the courage, since they weren't welcome and they weren't wanted? But they brought their culture and their lives with them. And of course they contributed wonderful things. I was just teasing that I wasn't. And it's really a wonderful book to read, and you will see, even when they got up north, it was not the promised land. They were not wanted. And so, again, wonderful book. This was my first introduction when I first started doing some research, and this I did years ago. It's called The Blood of Emmett Till by Timothy B. Tyson, kind of my little Bible. If you don't know who Emmett Till is, you should. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who went down to, I don't know where, somewhere in the South. I didn't write it down, probably Alabama or one of those places, that very far South. And he was 14, he was from Chicago, so he was used to a little bit different life. And he is accused of saying something inappropriate in 1955, saying something inappropriate to a white woman who ran a store. And what they did to that young boy is horrific. And it's his murder started, it was, what do I write here? It was part of a wave of terrorism in the wake of the 1954 Supreme Court decision that declared public school segregation unconstitutional. So you had a lot of angry white people. And it was the beginning of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks sat on her bus after that. Martin Luther King wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail. And one of the things that he wrote in that letter is, we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of bad people, but the appalling silence of good people. I knew those people. And I don't know what I would have been. So, drawing on new evidence, the book also covers what actually happened to Emmett Till. There's been a lot of rumors, but talks about it. And it also includes the only interview ever given by the white woman that started it all. And I want to give you just a quote in here from James Baldwin. Again, the glorification of one race and the constant debasement of another or others always has been and always will be a recipe for murder. The Blood of Emmett Till, just a very, very moving book. And then the last nonfiction book I want to recommend is The New Jim Crow. And what this book says is that mass incarceration is metaphorically the new Jim Crow. It's by Michelle Alexander. And it's about when we declared the war on drugs, we started incarcerating Blacks for things, for very, very strict sentences. And it says the number of people in prisons and jails for drug offenses increased more than 1,000% in the 30 years since we started the war on drugs. And the Blacks just got swept in to the system. 1 in 3 Black men had felony records. And it talks about the destruction of families. If you have someone who's incarcerated, what that does to your family, the cost, the mental anguish, what it does to children. And it says that 1 in 4 women in the United States has loved someone behind bars, has a loved one behind bars. 1 in 4 women, but if you're Black, it's nearly 1 in 2. Prisoners become second-class citizens when they're released. And they invest, this country has invested more than $1 trillion on the war on drugs. And to do that, they have cut funding for schools and decent housing and job creation. And I loved this quote in here. It says, the safest communities are not ones with the most police, prisons, or electronic monitors, but the ones with quality schools, healthcare, housing, plentiful jobs, and strong social networks that allow families to thrive. Bring them up, right? Bring them up by their boot. They have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, but you have to give hope to people, and you have to give opportunities. And Bill Gates says this book offers an eye-opening look into how the criminal justice system unfairly targets communities of color, and especially Black communities. It's just a cycle, just a cycle. If you really want to know something about a cycle, if you watch the series Wired, it will just tell you how the war, that is a beautiful example of the war on drugs and how you just can't get out. And so, The New Jim Crow. Now we're going to move over to some fiction. Beloved by Toni Morrison. I have not read this book, I'll be honest with you, but it did win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And it's about a slave born in Kentucky and who escapes. But in accordance with the Fugitive Slave Act, yes, of 1850, excuse me, marshals, if you're an escape, and marshals can go anywhere and bring a slave back. That was the fugitive slave law. And so this woman was escaped to Ohio. She was caught, and she wants to murder all her children, not murder them, I guess, kill them all, so that they don't have to go back and be slaves. She only kills one of them, and then she is caught, and everybody else goes back. In 1873, this book takes place in Ohio, and they are haunted by memories of the dead child named Beloved. So not a happy book, and I could not get through it because I just couldn't. I was busy reading all these other books. Another one that comes highly recommended is called Kindred by Octavia Butler. And this is about a modern day woman And she's suddenly transported back to the antebellum South to rescue a white son of a plantation owner. And she is drawn back several times, and each time she goes back, it becomes more and more dangerous. And Amazon gives the quote, "To face the horrors of slavery and explore the impacts of racism, sexism, and white supremacy then and now." Very highly recommended. Then there's the Richard Wright book called Native Son. This was written in 1940. It's about a 20-year-old who lives in poverty on the south side of Chicago, and he commits a crime. You know from the very beginning he's going to end up in jail because you can see the patterns and the way he lives. Of course, he ends up in jail for, I guess, killing. He actually kills a white woman. He does it, and he goes to jail. But his lawyer says some interesting things. And again, I've made some quotes on the back here. His lawyer says that the systemic causation is behind the crimes, that he was no escape from this destiny for any Black Americans, since they are the necessary product of a society that formed them and told them since birth who exactly they were supposed to be. I find that to be very difficult to deal with, and that's not necessarily true. There are plenty of Black people who rose up in the 1940s, who did things, who've become very successful against all the odds that were against them. But this quote, again by James Baldwin, is what really hit me. He said, "No American Negro exists who does not have his private Bigger Thomas," which is the name of the boy, his private Bigger Thomas living in his skull. And I think of that, I read that, and I think, you know, isn't that what Black Lives Matter is all about? And that you always feel that there's odds against you that you can't get through. And the introduction in this book by Arnold Rampersad says, "Wright believed that few Americans, Black or white, were prepared to face squarely and honestly the most profound consequences of more than 2 centuries of enslavement and segregation of Blacks in North America. He insisted the nation was facing a grave danger, one that would ultimately destroy the US if its dimensions and devious complexity were not recognized." And here we are. So, The Native Son. And I have children's books. Older children and teens, but just I want to talk about it because I read them all the time, being the children's librarian, and you learn so much. This, of course, is the classic Newbery book, Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. Just a wonderful book. It's set in Mississippi during the height of the Depression, and it is the one family's struggle to maintain their integrity, pride, independence in the face of racism and social injustice. That's how Amazon describes it. It's told through the eyes of 9-year-old Cassie, and in the Depression in Mississippi. And her family owns land, and they are one of the few families that do. And how important it is to keep that land, how important it is to have things, that the land will always be important. It gives you more than if you were just working for someone else. And what's really good about this book is Cassie sees all the things that happen in Mississippi during the 30s, but she sees it for the first time. And as she's learning, that's just the way things are. We're learning that's just the way things are, or were. There's 9 books about this family. Let the Circle Be Unbroken, Song of the Trees, The Land, The Well, Mississippi Bridge, The Friendship, The Road to Memphis, and The Gold Cadillac. Some of them are very thin. Some of them are my favorites. Highly recommended because it's told in truth. Another wonderful book is called One Crazy Summer by Rita Williams Garcia. This is also a Newbery book. And one of the things that I want to highlight, it's a National Book Award finalist. It won the Coretta Scott King Award. It won the Scott Odell Award for historical fiction, and it's a Newbery Medal honor book. So it's not a shabby book. It tells the story of 3 little Black girls from Brooklyn. They live with their father and grandmother, and the father sends them out to spend time in Los Angeles with, I'm sorry, not Los Angeles, I apologize, in Oakland, to spend time with their mother, who is a radical, back in 1968. And he wants them to get to know their mother. And she is, it is the story of family and being a family, being brothers and being sisters. But the thing that I was fascinated by in this book is it talks about the People's Center run by the Black Panther Party. And growing up in the 60s, you can imagine what I was taught about the Black Panthers. Nothing good. And lo and behold, again, wrong. The girls would go for breakfast and day camp to the People's Center in Oakland, and it provided a healthy, free breakfast to kids. And some people would say, oh yeah, but they would just make having recruits for the Panthers. Well, maybe, but they fed hungry kids. That's what they did. And this program was all voluntary, and they created it at its peak. It fed thousands of kids per day in at least 45 programs. And it eventually led to the USDA authorizing the school breakfast program in 1975, and today feeds over 14.7 million children before school. The other social programs offered by the Black Panther Party included free medical clinics, community ambulance services, and legal clinics. Just a different view of an often maligned group. You only hear the bad stuff. Long Way Down. It's a book in verse. It's not very long. Again, if you've ever watched the series The Wire, you will get this book immediately. 15-year-old Will's brother is shot. And Will lives by the rules of the streets, which is crying, don't, no matter what. Snitching, don't, no matter what. Revenge, do, no matter what. And so Will takes his brother's gun and he gets on the elevator. He's going to seek revenge because that's what he's supposed to do. And he gets on the elevator because he thinks he knows who shot his brother. Is he right? Is he wrong? And he gets on at the 7th floor, and it's a ride like no other, because on every floor, the elevator stops and somebody from his past gets on. And they're all dead. But they talk to him. It's just a beautiful book about life on these streets. And well, it says, told in verse, Long Way Down is a fast and furious, dazzling, brilliant book at teenage gun violence. And he learns things on his way down. So that's that. The last children's or teens book I want to recommend is The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. Oh, I'm sorry. A Long Way Down is written by Jason Reynolds. If you don't know him, he's a children's author, and he writes very relatable stories because, like when he was growing up, there weren't a lot of Black authors. He could never find books about people like him, which is the same reason why a lot of Black authors write children's books. The Hate U Give. It also spells, oops, it doesn't, not on this book, on my copy it does. The Hate U Give spells thug, T-H-U-G. There it is, I'm sorry, it was on my spine, there it is, thug, the thug life. 16-year-old Star lives between two worlds. She lives in a poor Black neighborhood, but she attends a private suburban school, and she has to kind of balance who she is between those two places. And one day, she's in a car at a traffic stop with her friend, Khalil, excuse me, with Khalil, and who is unarmed, and he is shot by a police officer. And you know the rest of the stories, how they go from there. But the story, it's very much a Black Lives Matter type of story, but it's also a very personal story because this murder, I don't want to call it a murder, this shooting becomes national news, and she knows him as Khalil. And they say, well, he was a thug and a gangbanger and a drug dealer, and she has to come to terms with who he was, but he was also her friend. And he was her friend who was trying to protect his mother, who was a drug addict, he grew up in poverty and hunger. And I didn't finish the book, I'll be honest with you. I watched the movie, and I highly recommend you watch the movie. I just ran out of time because, as you can see, I have lots of things I want to present. But it is not a difficult read. It is a very well-written book. I took the shortcut and watched the movie and cried. It was a very, very moving movie, and it is also, what I've read of this book is also very moving, and maybe give you a different perspective on the Black Lives Matter movement. And now I just want to talk quickly, 2 biographies. Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. She was born in 1928. At 3, her mother and her brother and she, were sent to live with their grandmother in Arkansas. The grandmother, it's a very rural town, and she owned the local grocery store. At 7, she meets her father, and he takes her to St. Louis to live with their mother. Something very tragic happens there. They move back to Arkansas to live with their grandmother. And then they eventually move out to California to live with the father and the mother. Separately, they are not together. There's dangers in every world that she enters. In St. Louis, in Arkansas, and in California. Everywhere this poor person goes, there are dangers that she has to face. This is the first of 7 autobiographies. And the quote that I have here is that this book was written in 1969, and up until then, Black female writers were marginalized to the point that they were unable to present themselves as central characters in literature that they wrote. This book made her a major autobiographical voice at the time. I know that I read it in high school, and then I read it again for here. Very moving, highly recommended. And then the last book, if we're talking about biographies, you can't really go anywhere today without reading Becoming by Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama grew up middle-class daughter, working parents in south side of Chicago, went to Princeton, went to Harvard Law, worked, married, raised a family, did the things the way Americans think people should live. And then she became the first Black First Lady of the United States, a position she never wanted. But when she became a powerful advocate for women and girls and helped families pursue healthier and more active lives. A true, I'm lost for words here. Someone that people should be looking up to. Role model is the word I'm looking for, a true role model, a deeply personal book. And I'm sure her family was part of the Great Migration if you go all the way back. So that is a white woman's understanding of Black history. A lot of emotions, a lot of things going on in my head, a lot of books to read, and I hope you try some of them. And again, as James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it is not faced. Have a good one.